They said the seas belonged to men. They said storms, cannons, and endless horizons were no place for women. And yet, history hides stories that prove otherwise. Imagine a world where fearsome pirates with names like Blackbeard or Captain Kidd strike terror into the hearts of sailors. But among them, hidden in plain sight, are women who not only defied expectations, but rewrote the rules of maritime history itself. The world has forgotten many of their names, silenced their victories, and buried their legends under centuries of male-dominated chronicles. But today, their voices return, louder than the crashing waves. Close your eyes for a moment and picture this: the creak of a wooden deck beneath your feet, the salt of the ocean stinging your lips, and the shadow of a black flag rising against the morning sun. Now, imagine that the person standing at the helm, commanding a crew of hardened men, isn't a ruthless, bearded pirate king, but a woman whose mere presence challenges everything society believed possible at the time. For centuries, women were expected to remain in the background. They were told their place was at home, in silence, under the rule of husbands or fathers. The sea, with its chaos and freedom, was considered strictly off-limits. And yet, some dared to defy. They disguised themselves as men, fought battles bloodier than any storybook tale, and carved out their names not only in the logbooks of ships, but in the nightmares of those who crossed them. One of the most famous of these figures is Anne Bonny, a woman whose story begins not with glory, but with scandal. Born in Ireland in the late 1600s, she was the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer and his maid. Society had already decided her fate. She would be branded, shamed, and kept invisible, but Anne had fire in her blood. As a child, she was said to have attacked another girl with a knife. She grew into a woman with flaming red hair, a temper to match, and a hunger for freedom that no cage could contain. When she met the pirate Calico Jack, Rackham, her fate was sealed. She left behind her husband and a life of confinement to embrace the lawless seas. But what made Anne Bonny unforgettable wasn't just her rebellion, it was her ferocity. In battle, she fought shoulder to shoulder with men, pistols blazing, cutlass flashing, earning the respect of hardened pirates who might have otherwise laughed her off as a novelty. Beside her was another legend, Mary Read. Her life was even stranger. Born illegitimate like Anne, Mary S. mother disguised her as a boy to receive financial support from her dead husband's relatives. She grew up learning to fight, to ride, to swear, and to survive in a man's world. When the disguise eventually became her identity, she joined the British Army and lived as a soldier. Only later did she find her way to the sea, where fate introduced her to Anne Bonny and Calico Jack. Together, these two women formed an alliance that shook the Caribbean. Picture the scene: a merchant ship suddenly ambushed, its sailors panicking as pirates storm the deck. Among the attackers, two figures stand out, not because of their strength, but because when the men hesitate, it is the women who charge first. Anne and Mary fought with such ferocity that enemies whispered they were demons in disguise. Witnesses later claimed that while many male pirates hid below deck when the tide turned against them, Anne and Mary stood their ground, screaming, fighting, refusing to surrender until the very end. But history, of course, is cruel. Their ship was eventually captured by the British. Calico Jack and the men were sentenced to hang. Anne's last words to him are said to have been, "If you had fought like a man, you need not be hanged like a dog. Cold, merciless, and unforgettable. Both Anne and Mary pleaded their bellies, claiming to be pregnant, and so their executions were delayed. Mary would die in prison of fever, but Anne's fate remains a mystery. Some believe she was released, others whisper she escaped. The truth is lost, but the legend remains. Anne Bonny and Mary Read are perhaps the most famous names, but they were far from alone. To understand the power of women pirates, we must travel east, across the seas, to China. Here, in the early 1800s, rose a woman so fearsome, so brilliant, that entire navies trembled at her name. Her name was Ching Shih. Born into poverty, Ching Shih began her life as a prostitute in a floating brothel. Her fate seemed sealed until she caught the eye of a notorious pirate leader. But Ching, she was no passive bride. When her husband died, she seized control of his vast pirate confederation, commanding not a single ship, not a dozen, but over 300 junks and more than 40,000 pirates. Let that number sink in. 40,000 men and women under her command, a force larger than many nations' navies at the time. And she ruled with ruthless precision. Ching, she established a strict code of laws. Loot was to be shared fairly. Deserters were executed. Female captives were protected. If any pirate assaulted a woman without consent, he was beheaded. Under her leadership, piracy in the South China Sea transformed from scattered chaos into an empire of terror and discipline. The Chinese navy tried to defeat her. They failed. The Portuguese navy tried. They failed. Even the mighty British Empire sent ships against her, only to retreat, humiliated. But here is the most astonishing part of Ching Shih's story. She didn't die in battle. Unlike almost every pirate, before or after, she negotiated her own surrender. In 1810, she struck a deal with the Chinese government, securing a pardon for herself and her fleet. She walked away from piracy not in chains, but in triumph. She retired wealthy, respected, and untouchable, living into her 60s. In a world where pirates were almost always executed, Ching Shih bent an empire to her will and rewrote history itself. Why are these stories hidden from us? Why do history books remember Blackbeard, but not Anne Bonny? Why do we celebrate Francis Drake, but not Ching Shih? The answer lies in power. History has long been written by the victors, and those victors were almost always men. Women who stepped out of line, who wielded swords, who commanded ships, were considered dangerous, not just because of their weapons, but because of the ideas they represented. A woman who could command a pirate fleet challenged the very foundation of society. If women could fight, if they could lead, if they could terrify kings and empires, then what else could they do? And so, their stories were buried. They became whispers, rumors, or at best, footnotes. But when we dig them up again, when we bring these women back into the light, something incredible happens. They remind us that the past was never as simple as we've been told. That rebellion, courage, and brilliance know no gender. Imagine a girl in the 1700s listening to tales of pirates around a fire, never knowing that some of those pirates were women who looked like her. Imagine how different history might have been if these stories had been celebrated, not silenced. That is why we must tell them, now, not as curiosities, but as legends equal to any man's, and these are only the beginnings of the tales. There are countless others, forgotten or half-remembered, women who disguised themselves as men to serve on ships, who turned mutiny into freedom, who carved out pieces of history only to have them erased. Each story reveals not just a pirate, but a rebel against a world determined to cage them. When you think of pirates, the mind conjures images of swaggering men with swords drawn, faces scarred, and voices booming over the roar of cannons. But what if behind those ragged coats and tricorn hats were women who had slipped into disguise, living double lives in order to taste the freedom denied to them on land? Some of the greatest mysteries of maritime history lie not in the treasures buried under sand, but in the secrets carried by women who walked among pirate crews without ever revealing their true identity. One such figure was Grace O'Malley, though her story belongs to a slightly different world, 16th century Ireland. She was no mere pirate. She was a chieftain, a ruler of men and ships, feared across the Irish coast. Known as the Pirate Queen of Connaught, Grace was born into the powerful O'Malley clan, a family already deeply tied to the sea. While other girls were expected to embroider or tend to family duties, Grace demanded to join the seafaring expeditions. Legend says that when her father told her she couldn't sail because her hair would catch in the ropes, she promptly cut it all off. From that moment, the ocean was hers. Grace commanded fleets that plundered merchant ships, levied taxes on trade routes, and defied the power of England itself. Her story carries one of the most unforgettable encounters in maritime history. In 1593, after her sons were taken captive by English forces, Grace sailed to England to demand their release. Imagine the sight: a weathered Irish pirate queen standing inside the royal palace, face to face with Queen Elizabeth, the first two of the most powerful women of the age, both defiant, both cunning, both unyielding. Holding a private conversation in Latin. The outcome: Grace secured the freedom of her sons and returned to the sea, a pirate queen who had bent even the English throne to her will. She would die years later, not captured or executed, but respected and still commanding her ships, a symbol of defiance against empire. The contrast between Grace O'Malley and figures like Anne Bonny or Ching Shih shows us something deeper. Women pirates were not just anomalies, they were leaders who adapted to the rules of their worlds, then broke them apart. Some disguised themselves to survive, others ruled openly, demanding respect by sheer force of will. But all carried within them a dangerous truth: that power is not defined by gender. In the Caribbean, stories circulated of other women who slipped unnoticed into the ranks of pirate crews. Some left no names behind, only fragments in records: a woman dressed as a man, discovered after death, or a sailor whose body revealed secrets upon burial. These anonymous ghosts remind us that history is full of untold stories, erased not by time, but by those who chose not to record them. How many Anne Bonnies and Mary Reads have we lost? How many legends drowned in silence? Consider the psychological weight of their choices. To become a pirate was already a life of constant danger. Death by cannon, drowning, or the hangman's noose loomed over every voyage. But for a woman, the stakes were doubled. Discovery could mean humiliation, abuse, or immediate execution. And so, these women lived in constant disguise, lowering their voices, binding their bodies, hiding every trace of who they were. Each day was a gamble, each moment an act of rebellion. Yet many of them not only survived but thrived, outpacing their male counterparts in skill, courage, and ambition. The legend of Charlotte de Berry is a haunting one, though its historical truth is debated. According to the tale, she was a 17th century Englishwoman forced into marriage with a brutal sailor. To escape him, she disguised herself as a man and joined the navy, where she fought alongside men until her secret was discovered. Eventually, she turned to piracy, commanding her own ship and carving her path across the seas. Her story, though wrapped in myth, speaks to something real, the desperation of women trapped in worlds where marriage could be a prison and the sea offered the only key to freedom. Whether Charlotte was fact or fiction, the very survival of her tale across centuries proves the Hunger people had to believe in women who could rise above the roles forced upon them. Even the darker side of piracy could not erase the sense of agency these women seized. Imagine the daily life on a pirate vessel, the stench of sweat and gunpowder, the constant threat of mutiny, the long weeks of hunger broken only by sudden bursts of violence. To survive there required not just physical strength, but mental resilience. Women who stepped into that world did so knowing the odds were stacked against them. Yet they fought, endured, and in some cases led with more brilliance than the men who doubted them. And what did the world on land think of them? To most of polite society, these women were monsters. They were not admired, but condemned as unnatural, almost inhuman. Newspapers and pamphlets described them with horror, as if their very existence was a threat to the order of civilization. A woman who wielded a cutlass was more dangerous to society than 10 male pirates, because she shattered the illusion that women were weak. The powers of the time feared them not just for the ships they stole, but for the ideas they represented. If one woman could defy her role so completely, what would stop others from following? This fear explains why many of their names faded into whispers. Yet, if you look closely enough, you can find traces in the strangest places: a ballad sung in a tavern, a painting hidden in a private collection, a diary entry scribbled by a frightened sailor. In these fragments, we glimpse women who lived as shadows, yet burned brighter than stars when they seized their moment. One of the most extraordinary aspects of these stories is how often they end not in defeat, but in transformation. Grace O'Malley negotiating with a queen, Ching Shih bending an empire, Anne Bonny slipping away into mystery. Each ending defies the pattern of men hanged at ports as warnings. It is as if these women, through some mixture of cunning, resilience, and sheer audacity, refused to give the world the satisfaction of their destruction. Their legends linger not as cautionary tales, but as sparks of possibility. But perhaps the greatest impact of women pirates lies not in their personal victories, but in the cultural echoes they created. Think of the myths we grow up with: heroes slaying monsters, warriors leading armies, explorers discovering new lands. Rarely do women stand at the center of these stories, yet here, in the hidden chronicles of piracy, they do. They reveal an alternate history, one where power and freedom were not bound by gender, but by will. What does that tell us about our own world? That perhaps the greatest prisons are not made of stone or iron, but of expectations. That those who dare to break them, whether with sword in hand or simply with a choice, change history in ways no empire can erase. Women pirates remind us that rebellion is not only about cannons and plunder. It is about the courage to claim a life that society insists you cannot have, and so the image shifts. The pirate is no longer just a man with a beard and a black flag. She is also Anne Bonny, pistol raised against impossible odds. She is Mary Read, blade dripping as enemies scatter. She is Grace O'Malley, standing before a queen, unbowed. She is Ching Shih, commanding tens of thousands with iron will. And she is countless others, unnamed, who braved disguise, exile, and death for a taste of freedom. Their stories form a hidden map across history, a constellation of rebels whose light was nearly snuffed out, but still flickers through time. And as we follow this map deeper, we find not just individuals, but movements, cultures, and legacies that ripple far beyond the seas they once sailed. The image of the pirate has always been larger than life. Yet, when you peel back the myths, you realize just how much of that image was shaped not only by men, but also by the women who defied the seas. And here is where the story takes a fascinating turn, because even when women pirates were erased from official history, their shadows crept into culture, folklore, and literature in ways few people recognize. Think of the classic pirate tales that echo through time, hidden treasure, swashbuckling duels, disguises, betrayals, and fearless captains who refuse to bow to authority. These tropes feel timeless, but they often stem from real women who lived them. Anne Bonny and Mary Read's ferocious bravery, for example, gave birth to countless ballads sung in taverns across the Caribbean and Europe. In those songs, their identities blurred with myth, turning them into almost supernatural figures, women who fought like demons, drank like men, and loved like no one could control. Even the idea of disguise, of a pirate living in secret as someone else, echoes through centuries of storytelling. How many plays, novels, and films hinge on a woman dressed as a man to escape her fate or claim her freedom? That trope, romanticized on stage and screen, has roots in the desperate reality of women like Mary Read, who bound her body, lowered her voice, and lived a double life for years. What begins as survival becomes legend, and legend becomes art. Yet there is irony here. While men like Blackbeard or Bartholomew Roberts were recorded in detail, their ships, their raids, even their fashion choices, women pirates were often remembered more as curiosities. Newspapers of the 18th century loved to sensationalize them, describing their beauty or scandal instead of their tactics or victories. They became exoticized, reduced to shocking anecdotes, a woman among pirates. But the reality was far more dangerous, and it is in that tension between fascination and fear that their cultural impact grew. Consider Ching Shih once more. In Europe, her story was barely known at the time, but in Asia, she became almost a phantom of the seas. Local fishermen spoke her name in whispers, stories of her fleet passed through generations. The idea of a woman commanding tens of thousands lingered in the collective memory long after she retired. That image, a woman at the helm of an empire of pirates, was so powerful it seeped into folklore, transforming her from a person into a symbol of order. Within chaos, a queen ruling lawless waters with stricter justice than many governments. But why do these stories continue to pull us in centuries later? Why do we lean closer when we hear the name of Anne Bonny, even if we know only fragments of her life? The answer lies in something deeper than adventure. Pirates represent freedom, not the polite freedom of laws and societies, but the raw, untamed freedom of living beyond rules. For women, that freedom was doubly intoxicating because it shattered chains that were both physical and social. A woman pirate wasn't just breaking the law of nations, she was breaking the law of gender itself. That is why their legends feel so alive, so dangerous. They are more than tales of plunder. They are whispers of revolution. As time passed, their stories began to influence how pirates were imagined. In the 18th and 19th centuries, writers took inspiration from the rumors of women on the seas. Characters emerged in novels who resembled Anne Bonny or Grace O'Malley, fierce, cunning, untamable. Sometimes they were villains, meant to shock readers with their wickedness. Sometimes they were tragic heroines, doomed by the very freedom they sought. Either way, they were unforgettable. And here lies another paradox. In trying to erase these women from history, society gave them a kind of immortality in myth. They slipped out of the pages of official records and into the far more enduring realm of story. Where governments saw criminals to be forgotten, culture saw archetypes to be remembered. Even today, when we see a woman dressed in pirate garb at a festival or in a film, whether we realize it or not, she is carrying the echoes of these forgotten figures. Hollywood often romanticizes pirates, turning them into lovable rogues or tragic antiheroes. But imagine how different those stories would feel if the world embraced the fact that some of the fiercest pirates who ever lived were women. Imagine if every child growing up on pirate stories knew not just Blackbeard and Jack Sparrow, but Anne Bonny, Mary Read, Grace O'Malley, and Ching Shih. There's a reason their memory resurfaces in cycles, rediscovered by each generation. In the 20th century, feminist historians and writers began unearthing their lives again, challenging the silence of traditional textbooks. They asked questions that still cut deep today. Why do we glorify the violence of men while ignoring the leadership of women? Why do we accept the idea of male outlaws as symbols of freedom, but treat women outlaws as aberrations? The answers reveal uncomfortable truths about power. When a man became a pirate, he was breaking laws of nations. When a woman became a pirate, she was breaking the laws of nations and nature as defined by patriarchal society. She was seen not just as a criminal, but as an abomination, a danger to the entire social fabric. That is why history tried to bury them so quickly, and yet the ocean remembers. The ocean, after all, does not care who commands a ship. It does not care if the hand gripping the wheel is calloused from sewing or from swordplay. The ocean respects only those who dare to master it. In that sense, women pirates were truer to the spirit of the sea than anyone. They embraced its chaos, its danger, its promise of freedom, and carved out lives on waters that never asked for permission. It is no coincidence that their stories return to us now, in an age when the roles of women are being questioned, rewritten, and expanded again. We look back and find not relics, but mirrors. Their defiance reflects our own struggles. Their courage inspires our own risks. Their freedom, however brutal, speaks to our own hunger for lives unbound by expectation. But let us not romanticize too far. Life as a pirate was harsh, often short, drenched in blood and fear. To say that these women lived freely is not to say they lived peacefully. They fought, they killed, they lost friends to disease and execution. Their victories came at terrible costs. And yet, in those fleeting moments when the wind filled their sails, and the horizon stretched endlessly before them, they held something precious, the power to live by their own rules. That is what makes their legacy so enduring. Not the battles they fought or the treasures they plundered, but the symbol they became. A woman pirate is an idea as much as a person, an idea of rebellion, of possibility, of freedom that defies every attempt to cage it. That is why their names still spark curiosity. That is why you are here, listening now, drawn into their world as if by a siren's song. And the truth is, we have only scratched the surface. Behind the legends are details lost in dusty archives, waiting to be uncovered. There are ships whose logs mention unnamed women aboard, graves unmarked where their stories ended. Artifacts recovered from shipwrecks that may once have belonged to them. Each discovery is a reminder that history is not finished. It is alive, breathing, waiting to be rewritten by those willing to look deeper. So the next time you imagine a pirate raising a black flag, do not picture only the bearded faces we've been shown. Picture, instead, Anne Bonny, fire in her eyes as she mocks a condemned man. Picture Mary Read, blade in hand, refusing to retreat when the deck runs red. Picture Grace O'Malley, standing taller than any English courtier as she bargains with a queen. Picture Ching Shih calculating, ruthless, unbreakable, commanding an empire of 40,000. Picture them not as anomalies, but as part of the very fabric of piracy itself. Because without them, the story of the seas is incomplete. And perhaps, without them, the story of freedom itself is too. If we strip away the myths and look closely, something remarkable emerges. Women pirates were not only fighters. They were leaders, strategists, and innovators who understood the ocean as both a battlefield and a stage. Their power came not just from fearlessness, but from their ability to command loyalty, to enforce order where chaos reigned, and to shape their crews into forces that could defy empires. This is where their legacy becomes more than just story. It becomes a lesson in leadership itself. Consider Ching Shih again. At the height of her reign, she controlled one of the largest pirate confederations in history. Imagine the logistics: 40,000 pirates across hundreds of ships, scattered across seas where storms and navies threaten daily. How does one woman hold that together? The answer lies in the code she enforced. Ching Shih created laws stricter than many governments, laws that turned reckless criminals into disciplined warriors. Loot was to be shared, loyalty demanded, and punishment swift. Anyone who disobeyed was executed without hesitation. To some, this might sound merciless, but to her crew it meant fairness. Under her rule, piracy was not just random violence. It was an organized system, a society on the waves. Now compare that to Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Their leadership was forged in fire, in the heat of battle rather than the cold calculations of empire. They were not commanding thousands, but they led through example. Witnesses described them fighting harder than men twice their size, cursing louder, charging first. Courage like that does something strange to people. It inspires. Men who might otherwise have dismissed them as women found themselves drawn into their defiance. In the lawless world of pirates, respect was earned not through birth or title, but through blood and steel. By standing unflinching, Anne and Mary bent the rules of their crews without ever needing to write laws. Their leadership came not from power over others, but from undeniable presence among them. And then there is Grace O'Malley, whose leadership existed in two worlds at once. On the sea, She was the terror of merchants, raiding coasts and demanding tribute. On land, she was a political force, negotiating with Irish clans, commanding loyalty from warriors, and standing face to face with one of the most powerful monarchs in history. Grace understood something vital. Piracy was not just about violence, it was about leverage. Each raid was not only plunder, but a message. Each negotiation, not only survival, but strategy. That ability to straddle the line between outlaw and stateswoman is what kept her power alive for decades. Leadership is not the only common thread. These women also reshaped ideas of justice and morality in ways their enemies could not comprehend. Ching Shih's rules protecting female captives, for instance, broke from the brutality common among pirates. In her fleet, women were not merely spoils of war. They were part of the social order she enforced. It was radical, not out of kindness, but because she understood that discipline required boundaries even in lawlessness. Grace O'Malley, too, carved her reputation not only through force but through protection, demanding tribute from fishermen in exchange for safety. She was both pirate and protector, outlaw and ruler. This duality reveals something deeper. Women pirates did not just copy the violence of men. They redefined what piracy could mean. They showed that outlawry could be a kind of governance, that rebellion could carry its own laws. And perhaps that is what frightened the powers of their time most of all, the realization that these women were not simply anomalies, but innovators of power itself. But what about the human side? It is easy to picture them as icons, but harder to imagine their inner lives. Did Anne Bonny ever lie awake in her hammock, haunted by the choices she had made? Did Mary Read, who had lived most of her life in disguise, ever wonder who she truly was beneath the layers of deception? Did Grace O'Malley, bargaining with Elizabeth, feel a kinship or rivalry to queens separated by sea but united by defiance? Did Ching Shih, retired and wealthy, ever glance at the horizon and feel the old hunger for the chaos she once commanded? These questions remind us that behind the legends were flesh and blood, doubts and desires. What makes their stories compelling is not that they were flawless, but that they were flawed and still unstoppable. They remind us that rebellion is not born in perfection, but in refusal to accept the roles assigned, the cages offered, the silence demanded. And their refusal did more than win battles. It left marks on history itself. Ching Shih forced empires to rewrite their naval strategies. Grace O'Malley bent English power to negotiation. Anne Bonny and Mary Read became living proof that courage could break the barriers of gender. Even the anonymous women who disguised themselves, though forgotten by name, carved out proof that freedom was not reserved for men alone. The echoes of their defiance ripple forward. When modern movements for equality speak of breaking barriers, they echo Anne Bonny's laughter in the face of death. When leaders enforce fairness with iron will, they reflect Ching Shih's code. When women step into politics with fire in their voices, they walk in Grace O'Malley's footsteps. When anyone dares to live a truth hidden beneath layers of disguise, they mirror Mary Read's struggle for identity. Perhaps this is why their stories endure even when the records are thin. They are more than individuals. They are archetypes of rebellion. They represent not just what happened, but what could happen, what still can happen when courage meets opportunity. And that is why, Centuries later, we still lean in to hear their names. But let us step back into the world they inhabited to understand just how astonishing their survival was. The seas of the 16th to 18th centuries were merciless. Disease ravaged crews, storms destroyed ships without warning, navies hunted relentlessly, and starvation haunted long voyages. To thrive in that world was difficult enough for men trained from childhood to endure hardship. For women, who entered those decks already carrying the weight of suspicion, the challenge was doubled, yet they endured. They didn't merely survive, they ruled. Think of the sheer audacity it took for a young Anne Bonny to walk away from her marriage and step aboard Calico Jack's ship. She had no guarantee of safety, no promise of power. What she had was a refusal to remain trapped. That kind of defiance cannot be taught. It erupts from within. Mary Read's story, too, shows a lifetime of adaptation, from childhood disguise to soldier to pirate. She shifted roles as the world demanded, until finally she seized one of her own choosing. Grace O'Malley, born into privilege, could have remained safe within her clan, but she chose to wield power on the open sea. Ching Shih, starting from nothing, built herself into one of the most successful pirates in history. Each of them reveals the same truth. Freedom is not given, it is taken. And yet, freedom is never simple. These women lived lives steeped in blood, betrayal, and uncertainty. Their victories came at the cost of violence. Their independence came at the price of exile from the societies they defied. This complexity is essential because it prevents us from turning them into mere fairy tales. They were not saints. They were rebels, and rebellion is always messy. But that messiness is part of their power. It shows us that liberation does not arrive clean and polished. It arrives raw, dangerous, and real. So what do these women teach us today? That leadership can take many forms: ruthless discipline, fearless example, cunning negotiation, or sheer defiance. That freedom is not something handed down, but something seized, often at great cost. That the roles society prescribes are not destiny, only cages waiting to be broken. And, above all, that history is never finished. It is alive, waiting for us to uncover its forgotten voices and recognize their place in the story of who we are. Their legacy, then, is not just on the seas. It is in us, in the ways we imagine power, in the courage we summon, in the rules we dare to break. And as we near the end of their tale, we must ask, what does it mean to remember them now? History often pretends to be a clear record, but in truth, it is a battlefield of memory. The stories we tell define what we believe is possible, and the stories we bury decide what remains invisible. Women pirates were buried for centuries, reduced to footnotes, erased from paintings, silenced in textbooks. And yet, despite every attempt to erase them, they rise again. They rise because their defiance was too great, their impact too lasting. Their lives too extraordinary to vanish completely. Imagine standing at the docks of Port Royal in the 1700s. You hear rumors of a fiery-haired woman with pistols at her side, fighting with the fury of 10 men. You hear whispers of another who lived years as a man, marching into battle with no one suspecting the truth. You hear sailors returning from Asia, trembling as they speak of a woman who commands 40,000, a pirate queen more terrifying than storms. These whispers drift through taverns, across oceans, into ballads and folk tales. And though they may be distorted, exaggerated, or half forgotten, they keep the fire alive. It is that fire we tend to now, because these women were not only pirates, they were symbols of possibility. They stood in direct opposition to everything society demanded of them. They were told to be quiet, to obey, to accept their cages. Instead, they carved freedom from cannon fire and salt water. Their courage reminds us that change is never granted, it is taken. It is not gentle, but fierce. Anne Bonny's story ends in mystery, but perhaps that is fitting. Mystery keeps her alive, suspended between fact and legend, untouchable by those who would reduce her to a warning. Mary Read died in prison, but her memory burns brighter because she fought until the very end. Grace O'Malley stood before a queen as an equal, refusing to bow, and in doing so declared that power is not given by crowns but by presence. Ching Shih retired wealthy, unpunished, unbroken, and in doing so shattered the myth that pirates must always fall. Each ending is different, yet each speaks of resilience. Their influence reaches further than ships and treasure. They force us to question who else has been erased. What other voices lie buried beneath the sands of history, waiting for us to uncover them? If women could command navies of pirates, then what else have we overlooked, dismissed, or silenced? These questions are not about the past alone. They are about us, here, now. Think of the young girl who hears the name Anne Bonny for the first time. She imagines the deck of a ship, the clash of swords, the fire of rebellion in her chest. She realizes that the limits placed upon her are not destiny, only illusions. Or the boy who learns that the fiercest pirate of the South China Sea was a woman, and in that moment, his idea of leadership shifts forever. These stories matter not because they are quaint curiosities, but because they reshape how we imagine the world. And there is something poetic about pirates being the ones to do it. Pirates were outlaws, enemies of all nations, hunted, despised, condemned. Yet it is often the outlaw who reveals the truth. By stepping outside the rules, they expose the fragility of the rules themselves. Women pirates were not supposed to exist, and yet they did. That simple fact is a crack in the wall of history, a reminder that the stories we accept as inevitable are never the whole truth. Picture the ocean itself as their witness. Waves crashing against the hull, winds tearing at the sails. Storms swallowing entire fleets, and still women stood at the helm, unafraid. The sea did not care for gender, for law, for expectation. It demanded only courage, and those who gave it earned its respect. In that sense, the ocean kept their secret long after men tried to erase them. It carried their legends across time until they reached us here. We learn that rebellion is not just chaos. It is creation. Anne Bonny created freedom from captivity. Mary Read created identity from disguise. Grace O'Malley created power from defiance. Ching Shih created empire from nothing. They remind us that freedom is not the absence of chains, but the presence of will. They remind us that leadership is not about titles, but about courage. They remind us that history is not a closed book, but a living story still being written. And so, as we close their tale, let us not leave them buried again. Let us carry them forward, not as novelties, but as part of the true history of the seas. When we think of pirates, let us think not only of Blackbeard's beard or Jack Sparrow's swagger, but of Anne's fire, Mary's blade, Grace's defiance, Ching's empire. Let us tell their names until they are no longer whispers but thunder, because in the end, their story is not just theirs. It is ours. It is the story of what happens when anyone, man or woman, dares to step beyond what the world says is possible. It is the story of courage, rebellion, and freedom carved into the waves themselves. And it is a story still unfolding every time someone chooses to live by their own rules. So the next time you hear the crash of the sea or see a black flag fluttering in fiction or film, remember the women who sailed before you. Remember that they lived not in silence, but in defiance. Remember that they rewrote history, not with pens, but with cutlasses, cannons, and unbreakable will. And if you found yourself pulled into their world, if you felt the salt of the sea on your lips and the fire of rebellion in your chest, then join us as we uncover more forgotten truths, more legends buried by time. Subscribe and keep sailing with us into the stories that refuse to stay hidden.